Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti a questa nuova puntata dei nostri dialoghi sul senso del lavoro. Il titolo della puntata di oggi è Quale teoria del lavoro emerge dalla filosofia di Kant? Dialogo con Jordan Pascoe. Kant è ampiamente riconosciuto come uno degli autori più importanti nella storia del pensiero ed è interessante chiedersi come abbia riflettuto sul tema del lavoro. Nel 2022 Jordan Pascoe ha dedicato a questo tema uno studio specifico, Kant's Theory of Labor, pubblicato da Cambridge University Press, in cui mostra come Kant abbia sviluppato una teoria articolata del lavoro all'interno della sua filosofia. Per questo dialogo abbiamo il piacere di avere con noi ospite la professoressa Jordan Pascoe, Assistant Professor of Philosophy alla Binghamton University. La professoressa è Associate Editor della Kantian Review e la sua ricerca si concentra sulla filosofia politica kantiana, con particolare attenzione al rapporto tra lavoro, cittadinanza e strutture del diritto nel pensiero del tardo illuminismo. Professor, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for bearing with me in English.
Nel suo libro, Kant's Theory of Labor, lei mostra come Kant abbia sviluppato una vera e propria teoria del lavoro all'interno della sua filosofia. Può raccontarci cosa l'ha portata a concentrarsi su questo aspetto del pensiero kantiano? E perché, a suo avviso, il lavoro occupa un posto così centrale nel pensiero di Kant? If you can help us with the first question.
Yeah, so my original interest in this stemmed from my work on Kant and women, and in particular, his relationship between the public and the private spheres. So for Kant, these questions turned out to be central to how he thought about citizenship, because he thought that the relation that one held in labor relations determined one's status as a citizen. So understanding Kant's account of citizenship meant looking into his conception of labor and the sort of organization of work. But the other thing I think that's worth saying about this is that Kant was writing at a really interesting moment for thinking about this question, as the feudal order is being dismantled, and market-based capitalism is really ascendant. So, by the time Marx is thinking about labor almost a century later, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. But when Kant is thinking about it, that transformation is sort of still in process. And so this means that we can track, looking at Kant's work, some of the ways that feudal logics get smuggled into the modern political order. So, a central assertion of my work is that one reason we should pay attention to domestic labor, the labor of wives and of servants, is that domestic labor and the household were one of the primary mechanisms by which feudal dynamics are embedded in modern and colonial orders. And I think that Kant is one of the few philosophers who really deals with this question directly during that period.
Nella dottrina del diritto, Kant distingue tra cittadini attivi e cittadini passivi e il lavoro dotato di indipendenza, in tedesco Selbstständigkeit, diventa la condizione necessaria per la piena cittadinanza. Può spiegarci come il concetto di lavoro struttura questa distinzione e più in generale quale ruolo ha nella concezione kantiana dello Stato di diritto? If you can help us with the second question.
Yeah, so Kant is trying to imagine a republic in which citizens are co legislators, right? So a kind of nascent democracy. And he doesn't want to rely on the old feudal idea that only landlords, only landowners, right, get to vote. Um, and that was, for example, sort of what Locke and others had argued, right? You had to own land, own property in order to be able to vote. Kant wants a more inclusive conception of citizenship that isn't limited to powerful landowners. And at the same time, he wants to ensure that land and business owners can't accrue additional political power by simply making all of their dependents vote the way that they want them to vote, right? There's a very pragmatic concern here. So he argues that those who are independent, right, those who have Selbstständigkeit, can vote, but that anyone who's dependent on them, an employee, a wife, a servant, an apprentice, can't vote, but can only be a passive citizen. Now, I think Kant had good reasons for wanting to make this distinction, but in doing so, he built a conception of citizenship that is necessary exclusionary. right? He argues that it's not necessarily exclusionary, right? He says, don't worry, each person can work their way up from a passive condition to an active one. But if each can work their way up, it doesn't follow that all can work their way up, since someone would still have to do the labor that he designates as dependent. And I think that this is an aspect of his argument that's gotten lost in a lot of sort of contemporary commentary, which likes to believe that we can just fix the exclusionary problem in Kant's argument by saying, don't worry, anyone can vote, including, for example, women. But Kant's dependency argument, I think, is really useful for tracking the ways that in his time and our own, working one's way up often means putting someone else in a position of dependency, right? Like if I open my own shop, someone else replaces me on the factory floor. When women go out to work, someone else has to do the laundry and pick the kids up from school. And so it becomes a useful way of thinking about patterns of outsourcing labor and of building meritocracies that hinge on jumping over somebody else.
Un aspetto particolarmente interessante della sua analisi è il rapporto tra diritto privato e lavoro in Kant. Lei mostra come le strutture lavorative, quindi il lavoro domestico, il lavoro salariato e le forme di servitù, siano oggetto del pensiero del diritto in Kant. Può aiutarci a comprendere come Kant concepisce queste forme di lavoro? Professor, can you help us with this third question?
Yeah, so, the central reason why I think Kant's conception of labor is worth contemporary attention is that he's thinking about forms of labor that tend to fall out of the picture in later analyses. So, Marx, for instance, has almost nothing to say about women's domestic labor until it's outsourced when they enter the factory. He says nothing about the class of workers who worked in service, despite the fact that he himself had servants. He centers his analysis around wage labor, and as a result, much later thinking about labor borrowed from these logics. And so I find Kant useful for unpacking these forms of work that fall outside the frame of wage labor. Um, and for attending to how they have been and continue to be useful for maintaining social hierarchies. So, domestic labor is, of course, gendered. But as it is increasingly outsourced as women enter the workforce, it's also organized according to race, ethnicity, and citizenship status, both globally as well as locally, right? A lot of domestic labor is outsourced to underpaid and ethnicized immigrants, for example. The work that would have fallen under the category of service labor in Kant's and Marx's time has largely become the tip economy and the gig economy. Think restaurants, laundries, hospitality, Uber, childcare, things like that. This work has fewer legal and economic protections, and it's designed to be precarious. In the US, it's also heavily racialized, and this racialization is the direct result of conceptualizing wage labor as white labor and forcing non whites into forms of labor that are not protected by regular wage labor contracts. So I think that Kant, by paying attention to these forms of labor, gives us interesting tools for thinking about the distinctive forms of domination that structure the domestic, tip, and gig economies, and for thinking about how, in our contemporary moment, those industries are often dominated by immigrants without the right to vote, making them passive citizens in Kant's sense.
Rispetto al tempo in cui Kant ha scritto, le forme di lavoro sono profondamente cambiate. Alla luce della sua ricerca, che cosa può offrirci oggi la teoria kantiana del lavoro per ripensare il significato dell'attività lavorativa e le strutture dei rapporti di lavoro in un'epoca di automazione e di nuove forme di organizzazione del lavoro? Professor, can you help us with this fourth question?
Yeah. So, one of the reasons why I was compelled by Kant's thinking on work was that his description of the labor of servants, again, a category of work about which Marx has nothing to say, was that it seemed to capture an important aspect of the work that I and most of my professionalized friends do. That is, very few of us experience ourselves as wage workers with a working day delimited by a contract. Our work is better understood in terms of an agreement to do whatever is necessary for the good of the firm or the institution, which is how Kant describes servants' duties. That means that there's no end to the working day. There's no end to the tasks that can be required. And also that we're expected to behave in all parts of our lives as representatives of the firm or of the institution. That is to, in our current parlance, like, maintain appropriate personal brands, right? Um, at all times, in precisely the same ways that servants were once expected to maintain the dignity of the family that they worked for at all times. So I think that the structure of household labor, including servants, is one way that feudal logics get embedded in modern legal and economic orders. And I would argue that the structure of modern professional employment reflects these feudal logics, which are not aptly captured by Marxist notions of the working day. And so Kant was, as I've said, he was writing at a time when the structure of work and its role in organizing political and social life was drastically changing. And I think we find ourselves in a similarly revolutionary moment because of automation and the new forms of work organization that you've described. Um, and I think this is accelerating, right, with the rise of AI. So there's been a lot of talk about how the replacement of workers by AI could be addressed through variations on, say, a universal basic income, right? Alternatives, in other words, to being required to work. And I think that one insight of Kant's that's really worth sitting with here is the idea that we think of citizenship as tied to our role as workers in a deep way, right, that has been sustained for hundreds of years. And so, if the rise of AI and the automation of work means that we're not going to be worker citizens anymore, then we're going to need to rethink not just work, but actually citizenship accordingly as well. And so Kant's theory of labor, I think, is one attempt to rethink citizenship at a time of massive economic upheaval with widespread social impacts. And so I think we can learn from it as we attempt to grapple with our own similar moment.
Grazie professoressa, la ringraziamo veramente molto per la sua partecipazione e per averci aiutato a esplorare il rapporto tra lavoro e diritto nel pensiero di Kant. Professor, thank you very much for this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These were excellent questions.
Io e Luigi vi diamo appuntamento alla prossima puntata. Ciao.